Hello, and welcome to my podcast. Today I will be talking about melittology. What is melittology, you might ask? Well, according to Wikipedia, it is the branch of entomology, or the study of insects concerning the scientific study of bees. Bees are perhaps one of the most important insects in the world because they help provide millions of people with food. And I'm not just talking about honey, I'm talking about pollination. Most people know that bees are pollinators, but many don't know what exactly this means or why it's so important. In short, pollination is the process of pollen being transferred from a male flower to a female flower. The plant is now fertilized and will be able to reproduce and grow. Bees are not the only pollinators in the world, but they are the most efficient. Bees are attracted to bright flowers with sweet nectar, and over millions of years, plants have evolved to be attractive to bees. Bees get most of their nutrition from nectar and pollen, so what happens is the bee lands on the male flower, and it vibrates its body, and then the pollen becomes loose within the flower. The bee then consumes its nectar and some of its pollen. And one of the biggest physical differences between a wasp and a bee is that a wasp would have a smooth body and bees are furry. So what happens is the pollen sticks to the bee's fuzzy little bodies so that when it flies to the next flower, the pollen is transferred and the pollination process is complete. There are over 20,000 species of bees and they pollinate 1/3 of the world's crops. Pollination is an imperative process to crop growth. In places where bees can't really live, humans actually have to pollinate flowers by hand, often using a paintbrush to transfer the pollen. Having bees do this for us is much easier and it's free. Over the last several years, Save the Bees has almost become a meme in pop culture, kind of like Save the Whales or Save the Sea Turtles, and I myself carry around a reusable straw wherever I go. And all species are interconnected and important, but this is not a podcast about whales or sea turtles. This is a podcast about bees, so I'm going to be talking about what's happening to bees and why we need to save them. In America, we first started to notice a decline in bee populations in around the 1940s, so basically right after World War II. So farmers had stopped using cover plants such as clover and alfalfa, which are natural fertilizers, and instead they started using synthetic fertilizers. But clover and alfalfa plants are very tasty and nutritious plants for bees, so now we have a problem because we just took away some of the bees' food. In addition, we started using herbicides to kill weeds, and a lot of the weeds that we were killing were actually flowering plants, which would be another source of food for bees. And, of course, we started using pesticides, and there's actually been quite a lot of research, and some of it's inconclusive, done with the use of pesticides and how it affects bees, because some studies found that pesticides don't actually harm adult bees. But what some researchers did find, however, was that it can kill bee larvae, in other words, killing the baby bees, which is bad too because now that generation of bees has been killed off. One class of pesticide, though, has been known to directly kill bees, and that is called neonicotinoids. This is a relatively new class of insecticide that is meant to kill pests that eat the leaves of crops, and by ingesting the leaves, the bugs are poisoned and they die. You might think, well, how does this affect bees? Bees don't eat leaves, and you're correct. But when these neonicotinoids are applied in a high enough concentration, they can actually penetrate the plant all the way to the pollen and the nectar. And if a bee were to ingest enough of it, it would die. And this class of insecticide acts as a neurotoxin to bees, so even if a bee just consumes a little bit of it, it can cause disorientation and the bee isn't able to find its way home. Neonicotinoids have also been connected to colony collapse disorder, which is a phenomenon in which up to 90% of worker bees just vanish from their hives. We're still not 100% sure what causes this, but neonicotinoids probably play a huge part. It is believed that when a bee brings back neonicotinoid-infected nectar, it affects the whole hive, like it spreads to the other bees in the hive. And the hive now contains a bunch of disoriented and confused bees who often leave the hive and never come back, and that's not good, and it's becoming a very common issue. So I've talked about herbicides and pesticides and how they've caused decline in hives, but it's also worth mentioning that bees are affected by disease and parasites just like any other living thing. For example, mites spread rapidly through hives, and within a few months, mites can completely wipe out an entire colony, which is also not good. One other, large contributing factor to the decline of bees is something called crop monoculture. This is the practice of only planting one type of crop at a time, and this limits the biodiversity that is available to bees, and it can affect their survival. And speaking of lack of diversity, bees are actually being bred and brought to farms where there is a need for pollination. But this creates, you guessed it, a lack of diversity within bee colonies, and diversity is really important for species adaptation and reproduction. So here's a small-scale example of what could happen if a colony of bees dies. let's say this colony pollinates the almond trees on a farm, and if the almond trees aren't pollinated, the hulls of these nuts can't be used to feed cattle and chicken, which is pretty common. Fewer bees means fewer almonds. Fewer almonds means a decline in livestock, which results in less milk, cheese, chicken, beef, eggs, and more. And also, we wouldn't have almonds. Bees are a part of an intricate ecosystem that depends on them for their pollination skills, and entire ecosystems could collapse without their help. Now, this is not to say that humans would go extinct without bees, but our lives would certainly be a lot different. For one, we probably wouldn't have coffee, and that alone is enough to make me want to get into bee conservation. Bees pollinate cotton too, so we could kiss all cotton products goodbye. Thousands of plant species would no longer be able to survive, and many people would go hungry as a result. So we would mainly be living off corn, wheat, and rice, since these plants are pollinated by wind. And this has nothing to do with ecology, but as a side note, bees contribute about $265 billion to the economy every year. So right now you might be thinking, holy crap, I want to save the bees, and it might be a bit daunting because one single human can't stop the use of neonicotinoids. That would probably have to come from the government, and it would take years and cost millions of dollars. So what can we do? One of the easiest and most accessible ways for us to help the bees is to plant native bee-friendly flowers, and what I mean by native is flowers that naturally grow in the area you live in. For example, here in Fargo, it wouldn't be very helpful to the bees to plant flowers that are native to Mexico. Just a quick Google search will help you identify bee-friendly native plants that you can plant in your gardens, in your yard, along the road, or in my case, on a pot on my apartment balcony. And I just did a quick search, and some flowering plants native to this area include sunflowers, lilies, black-eyed Susans, geraniums, milkweed, thimbleweed, and a couple of my personal favorite names, pussy toes and sneezeweed. Bees are in trouble and they need our help. If you enjoy the huge variety of food available at your local grocery store, it's in your best interest to invest in bees' future. So please don't swat them when you see one, unless it's a hornet. Those suck and you can kill those. And consider planting some native flowers when the snow in Fargo finally melts. So I'm going to end this podcast with a joke. What did the bee say to his girlfriend? I can't help falling in love with you.